For those of you who are here for the first time, welcome. I hope to see you again more often on other occasions on campus. There's plenty of other literature outside in the hallway of a variety of different events. Please feel free to pick them up and join us. And for those familiar faces that I see here quite often, welcome back. Great to have you back on campus. I want to take a moment to say to you that events like this don't happen by themselves. Usually, there's somebody behind the scenes who's really cranking things up to make these kinds of things happen. And Emma Oxford is one such person who really deserves a great deal of our appreciation. And for a person like myself in the kind of position that I have, it's great to have people who are self-starters, who keep you on track, and you don't have to worry about something getting done when you hand it over to them. And it really is a pleasure to work with Emma. And let me just simply hand this over to her from here.
Thank you very much, Vijay. Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to the opening session of the 29th year of the Books and Coffee program. That is quite a record. It must be one of the longest running programs here at Concordia. And very pleased to see so many of you here tonight. This particular series of Books and Coffee is supported entirely by donations from the Friends of Concordia, and we really do appreciate your generosity. If you enjoy these programs and all the other community events that we run, please consider joining Friends of Concordia if you haven't done that in the past. We'd really welcome your donations, small or large. Every few dollars makes a difference. And there are brochures out in the hall if you'd like to pick one up on the way out. We do have a number of other events coming up, which again are supported by Friends of Concordia and some of our other generous sponsors. And just next Tuesday, we'll have the first business breakfast of the season. That is an early start, breakfast at 7, the talk at 7:30 in the morning. And Tuesday's speaker is Mark Patterson, who is a Bronxville resident and chairman of Matlin Patterson Global Advisors, and he will be talking about distressed equity investing, so also a financial topic. Please come along to that and just drop me a line if you would like to do so. We also have our traditional Books and Coffee raffle tonight. The prize is a gift certificate from Womrath's bookstore in Bronxville. If you have not already filled out one of the gold cards with your contact information, please raise your hand and that will be your entry to the raffle, and we'll make sure that you get a card to fill in now during the talk. Tonight, I'm really thrilled to welcome Randy Jones and his wife, Connie, home to Bronxville, where they lived for many years. You've got a lot of good friends in the audience, Randy, as you know. So Randy Jones is every bit as entrepreneurial as many of the men and women he writes about in his book, The Richest Man in Town. He was the youngest publisher of a major magazine when he became publisher of Esquire magazine at the age of 29. Currently, Randy's chairman and CEO of American Idea Lab, an early-stage media investment firm. I hear he's also developing a reality TV show called something like The Next Richest Man in Town. Randy serves on several corporate boards and on the boards of the Council for Economic Education and the Committee to Encourage Corporate Philanthropy. Recently, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society of America honored him as Philanthropist of the Year. Randy is a graduate of the University of Georgia and recipient of their highest alumni honor, the Alumni Merit Award. These days, Randy and his wife and 3 sons divide their time between Carrollton, Georgia, which is their hometown, and New York City. Randy, we're very pleased to welcome you here tonight. He's been described as the anthropologist of America's self-made rich, and we can't wait to hear their secrets of success and happiness. Randy, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Emma, and thank you, VG, and thank you, friends, for coming out tonight. It's a pleasure to be home, I must tell you. We get a little nostalgic every time we pull down 22 these days. And technically, we can say up until next Thursday, when our property closes, which we finally sold, we're still taxpayers of Bronxville for one more week. But, probably the only thing that Emma didn't say in that overly generous introduction about me is that I love country music. And not because I'm a boy from Carrollton, Georgia, because I didn't even like it when I was growing up there as a kid. But I've become a real fan of it in the last few years as we've begun to spend more time in Georgia. And the reason I have is because country music always tells a story. There's always a truth in it. Think about it. Mama, don't let your babies grow up to be cowboys. Or, I liked you better before I knew you so well. Or one I remind my wife of quite frequently, if I said you had a beautiful body, would you hold it against me? And perhaps my favorite of the moment is Tracy Lawrence's new country hit, which says, you can't hide redneck behind a three-piece suit. So this redneck from Georgia, who spent the great majority of his life in Bronxville, is awfully glad to be back home today. But the reason I bring up country music is because there are those truths, there are those stories. And 2 years ago, I set out to find a different kind of truth, the truth about the American dream. Was it alive and well? And if so, how do you attain it and maintain it in these turbulent economic times? So what I did was I journeyed across America to 100 towns, from New York City to Natchez, the biggest town being New York, the largest being Bell Spring, Virginia, population 169. And if you think about it, think about where you grew up. Every town has one. A richest man or woman in town, that is. And the idea came to me years ago when I was sitting at a country club in Carrollton, Georgia, having lunch with my 14-year-old nephew, and he looked at me and he said sort of sotto voce, Uncle Randy, you see that man right there? That's the richest man in town. And it hit me, every town has one. And so often I think those of us in the media, and particularly those of us who live in New York, tend to view the world of success and to a lesser degree the world of wealth creation through the lenses of either Wall Street or Hollywood. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to see what success looked like in Amherst, Massachusetts, and Anchorage, Alaska, and Fort Lauderdale and Fort Worth, and Cleveland, Ohio, and Cleveland, Tennessee, and because of writer's prerogative, Carrollton, Georgia. And I busied myself writing letters, most often to the business editor of the local newspaper, to say, who is the most successful self-made man or woman in your town? And incidentally, since there's such a large group of women here tonight, I want you to know there are women in The Richest Man in Town. There were 4 that were a part of the book and were actually the richest self-made person in their particular towns. Now, we went to 100 towns, but the question that I'm most often asked, when someone sees the cover of the book is, well, who is the richest man in town? And obviously that depends on the town. And incidentally, I did not do Bronxville because, frankly, it's a village, not a town. But that's not really the reason. It's there are too many of them, for goodness sakes, to choose from. But what I did do was go to 100 other towns. And let me just sort of give you a collective look at the richest man in town. He's the owner of the largest electronics amplification company in the country and calls Jimmy Buffett his best friend. He's the best-selling horror writer of all time and probably the most successful and financially successful writer of all time. He's the guy who created Nintendo Guitar Hero with his brother in the basement of their homes when he was still in his teens. He is a she who created the American Girl doll company. He's the founder of Home Depot. He's the man who poured all of the concrete for the Georgia Dome and the Georgia Aquarium. He's the man who brought NASCAR to Wall Street. He's the man who runs a company that's the largest manufacturer of wheelchairs in the world. He is currently in Cleveland, Tennessee, building a limestone mansion that is an exact replica of the one that he loved so much when he was growing up in the 50s and 60s when he was watching the Beverly Hillbillies. And Connie and I were just there to see it the other night. He's the guy who made log homes luxury homes. He has a yacht called Limitless, much like his ambitions. He's the founder of the Subway sandwich. He's the guy who took a small pet foods company in Ohio and turned it into a $2.3 billion empire that he sold to Procter & Gamble in the late 90s. He calls this man, Tom Watson, his greatest hero and mentor. He runs the company, or owns the company that protects the Queen of England with his security system. He made the first billion of his $3 billion fortune hauling trash. He is the rich roaster of the premium coffees in Burlington, Vermont, the most successful premium coffee company in the country. He's the guy who founded Pilot Oil, which is lovingly referred to as the trucker's paradise. He founded the Miss Hawaiian Tropic Beauty Contest because he founded Hawaiian Tropic. He is a she who is an avowed environmentalist and the founder of Burt's Bees. Think you probably know the Google Boys. He took a waffle iron from his wife's kitchen and made his first running shoe, and it became a running sensation. He's the man behind the success of the latest James Bond franchise. He's the antivirus software pioneer who built an entire town in Mexico called Rodeo, New Mexico, and just sold everything he owns in order to move to Costa Rica. He owns the Magna Carta. He calls Donald Trump his best friend, though we won't hold that against him. And of all the people I interviewed, the poorest one among them, at the time that I interviewed them, was worth $100 million. And there wasn't a crook among them. And that's what was so gratifying to me. They're what I call the rooted rich, or the responsible rich. These are the people who are building businesses in their towns, they're creating jobs for Americans, and they are changing the very landscapes of those towns. Now, the question I most often ask there's my attorney, when people hear that I wrote this book is, Carl Hamann asked me, how much do you hit them up for? But that was not really the first question. Most people ask me, what is the single greatest commonality of these richest men and women in town? And the truth is, they're exactly 12. Thus the subtitle of the book, The 12 Commandments of Wealth. But probably the one that was the most startling to me, the most surprising, was that they don't set goals. As Charlie Cauley, the richest man in Wilmington, Delaware, said to me, life by the inch is a cinch, life by the yard is hard. I expected them to talk about their vision, their long-range plans, what their 5-year plan was like, and to a man or woman, they all said, never had a goal in my life. And that really shocked me, because how many books have we seen with the light bulbs on the cover and telling us that you've got to have, you've got to begin with the end in mind, as Covey says and others. The other thing that really surprised me was how many times I heard them say, Randy, it was not about the money. I never set out to get rich. And that I found at first, as a journalist, fascinating, but I was also a little cynical about it. because I said to myself, it's easy now that you sit on atop a $100 million fortune to say that it was never about the money. But I became very convinced over the course of this 2 years in interviewing these people that was absolutely right. That the way they got rich was by adding some real value to their community, to their state, indeed to the universe. And the money was the natural byproduct. Now, neuroscientists tell us that we're all hardwired to do certain things. We all have certain aptitudes, talents, interests, and inclinations. And what I found was that these richest men in town seemed to know that instinctively. And they also knew that they had to sort of do a personal assessment first. They believed that knowing others is intelligence, knowing yourself is true wisdom, mastering others is strength, mastering yourself is true power, and it's really the single greatest key to becoming the richest man in town. Now, let me ask you a question. How many of you, as you were growing up, or how many of you told your kids as they were growing up, this is America. You can be anything you want to be, anything you dream of being. Raise your hands. How many of you said that? Okay. About half of you, according to the richest man and woman in town, are absolute liars. Or you were lied to. And not deliberately, of course. I'm sure that was, just encouragement on your part. But what the richest men and women in town kept telling me was that you can't be anything you want to be, anything you dream of being, but you can be so much more of what you instinctively, innately, almost genetically are programmed to be. So the key was realizing that, doing the introspection necessary, and then monetizing it. Like the essential truths in country music, the truth of how one grabs hold of the American dream, I talk about in the book and call it, is finding your perfect pitch. It's finding that thing that you do so well that work isn't work. All of these people I expected to be workaholics, right? Because you don't get to have that kind of fortune without working hard. And they all did put in the hours, and they all did work hard. But because they had found the thing that they were so instinctively right, what Jim Haslam said, what was right about him. He said, you got it. He's the richest man in Knoxville, Tennessee. He said, boy, you got to find out what is right about you. When I asked him, what's the secret to success and wealth creation? And he said, I think, if you have to go to work each day, you've got the wrong job. That's not to say they didn't put in the hours. They did. They worked hard as you and I might define it. But for them, it wasn't work. It was absolute pleasure. They were doing what they were uniquely gifted to do. Warren Buffett, great example, said to me, and it said to anyone who's willing to listen, I was wired at birth to allocate capital. $40 billion later, I think he's proved the precept. So figuring out what your perfect pitch is the key, I think, to knowing yourself and unlocking your fullest potential. Jonathan Nelson, the richest man in Providence, Rhode Island, the private equity kingpin, told me a fascinating story about that I think demonstrates this know thyself or find your perfect pitch principle. He said he took a class in Beethoven when he was at the university, or Brown University. And he decided that he was going to take this course because he said, frankly, it was a musical genre I knew nothing about, and he figured there'd be a lot of women in the class. So he went in, and on the first day, the professor hit a note on the piano and said to a room like this, what note is that? And he noticed several hands went up, and he was clueless. So he raised his hand, and he said, Professor, how did they know that? Because he'd called on the attractive young woman in front of him, and she had said, it's C sharp. And he said, how does she know that? And she looked around at him and batted her eyes and said, I have perfect pitch. And he learned what he says was one of the most valuable business lessons in his life, was that this was something that no matter how hard he studied or how hard he tried, He could not develop perfect pitch. You're either born with it or you're not. So he learned what he calls the power of relative skill differences. And he learned that he would not go into music. That would not be his perfect pitch, but private equity ended up being his perfect pitch. And $2 billion later, he's living the dream, so to speak. And he went on further to tell me that when his company bought MGM, or an interest in MGM, a few years back, one of his biggest concerns about committing those huge dollars to MGM was what would happen to the James Bond franchise. It was one of the most important assets of the company. So before the deal was closed, he asked to sit down with Barbara Broccoli, the daughter of Cubby Broccoli, who started the whole Bond franchise. And he knew that she knew what she was talking about, but he wanted to be convinced that there was a future to that to the Bond franchise. So he sat down with Barbara, and she basically said, "We've done 21 successful Bond flicks, and I believe the next James Bond should be Daniel Craig." Well, he sort of freaked. Number one, he hadn't heard of Daniel Craig. Then she showed him a picture, and he said, "He's short and he's blonde." Not exactly what I would think of as the James Bond character. Well, you know how the story ended. It's become the most successful Bond ever, or he has. And so he said that Barbara Broccoli had the perfect pitch for Bond. And that's exactly what he looks for whenever he's investing in any company that he's going to ultimately take over. So Nelson's perfect pitch has been recognizing the perfect pitch in other individuals that he places his investment in or places in the companies that he buys. So he said to me, the lesson, Randy, is very clear, and that is that no amount of sort of positive thinking or American can-do attitude is enough. It's a wonderful thing, and it's a good quality to have. But the only way you will ever be truly successful and have the bank account to prove it is by finding your perfect pitch. When I interviewed Stephen King, he said the same thing to me. He said, "Randy, there was nothing else I was made to do. My whole life I wanted to write. That's all I do. That's all I love to do. That's all I know how to do. It's all I want to do." I found the same true in Meridian, Mississippi with Hartley Peavy. Hartley is one of the great characters, and again, like many of these RMITs, as I lovingly refer to them, a man that has created, in his case, a $400 million fortune, and yet most people have never heard of him. I mean, maybe if you've bought an amplifier, or if you've had a son like Don and I have, who's always buying this stuff, you might know Peavy. But, you know, here he is in a town of 40,000 people worth $400 million, and he told me the story about how he heard Bo Diddley play when he was a young man, and he said, "I decided then I wanted to be a star guitar player like Bo Diddley." And he said, "I spent the next 8 years trying to become a star guitar player." And he said, "Then I had to have an intervention with myself because I realized I was not becoming a star player, but while he was trying to become that star guitar player, he was building amplifiers to try to make himself sound better." And he said, really what was happening was I was just sounding like a louder, bad guitar player. But he said, what I realized, what I was really good at, was building electronic amplification. And you know how that story ended. So the bottom line is that the richest men and women in town systematically find what they call their perfect pitch, and they systematically divest themselves of the things that they don't naturally excel at, that they don't find enjoyable, that they don't find emotionally or intellectually stimulating. Quite simply, I was amazed to realize that they seek more pleasure and less pain. And I heard this time and time again. The path of least resistance is often the greatest path to the greatest amount of success. Because meaning, if you are pushing a boulder up a mountain, and I've had a few companies where I feel like I'm pushing the boulder all the time, and you're not doing something where the wind feels sort of naturally to your back, most likely you're not going to become the richest man in town, and you're not going to be happy in the process. That's the other question that I often get is, people like to think if they've had this kind of success, they must be miserable, right? And I was asked recently on the Today Show, does money buy happiness? And I said yes. I said yes, at least in the case of the self-made rich, the people who've created the wealth themselves and have enjoyed the journey to getting there. So I think it's kind of like what Maya Angelou said. The secret to becoming the richest man in town, to being so successful and to being happy in the process, is that she says you can only become accomplished at something you love. Don't make money your goal. Instead, pursue the things you love doing and then do them so well that people can't take their eyes off of you. So there are 11 other commandments to great wealth creation. I can't stand here all night and tell you those, but they're in the book. What I can tell you is that this perfect pitch concept is unquestionably the most important key to becoming the richest man or woman in town. So remember, you can't be something you're not, but you can be so much more of what you innately, intrinsically, instinctively are. And one thing is certain, everyone has their own unique perfect pitch. Finding it is the key. So here's hoping that everyone here tonight, and it looks to me like you've found it. But if not, that you've been inspired to attempt to find that, to do the introspection necessary to get there. One thing that I am very, very certain of, though, after this 2-year journey of traveling all across the country and interviewing these great American success stories, is that the American dream is very much alive and well. Very, very alive. And I think that gives us all great hope. So thank you for coming tonight, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Well, you give us a lot to think about there, Randy, and I know that Randy would be happy to answer questions, and let's open this up for discussion. We have a couple of microphones, so we will pass one to you and so that you can speak into that when you ask your question.
I certainly enjoyed your talk, Randy.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. But I was wondering about some of the other values that came out of this. For instance, this young woman who had perfect pitch, the C sharp, and she might have turned out to be if she followed her star, she'd turn out maybe to be a great performer, a classical pianist or singer.
Right. I asked Jonathan Nelson if he knew what happened to her, and he said, not only did I not follow up, she didn't follow up with me when I first asked her out after that class. So he doesn't know what she ended up doing. But
or how about a person who likes astrophysics? I mean, in other words,
right.
People can meet, but they wouldn't necessarily make a lot of money. But they certainly enjoy what they're doing. They're great professors, or they can truly get a Nobel Prize or something.
Well, I think the whole point is, yes, I first defined this group of people by their net worths, obviously, because that is the easiest thing to look at as a barometer of success. But I say throughout The Richest Man in Town that this really isn't about just accumulating assets and wealth. It's about finding the thing that matters most to you and that brings you the most happiness. I have an older son who's a military history aficionado, and his whole life that's all he cared about. And he's going to be the richest man in town in the most holistic sense of that word and the most sort of wonderful definition of the word rich, because he's doing what he loves doing. And so I think that's what we all strive for, and that's what we all want for our kids and the people that we love most.
There was an article in today's New York Times about David Rubenstein, who was the head of the Carlisle Group.
Yes.
And it was very interesting because what he gets out of his riches is to give as much of it as a way as possible to better the world. And he said that the one thing that he can't have he would love, instead of being 60, being 50, because life is the most important thing. And I thought that was very interesting. He said, you know, I can't be 50 again. And he said that making money is the easiest thing. So really.
Well, and again, I interviewed David, and he's a great man, and he's the richest man in Washington, D.C. David Rubenstein runs the Carlyle Group. I saw that article today, too, and it's absolutely true. What he was saying was these guys value their time immensely. I remember Red McCombs, the richest man in San Antonio, saying, we can always make more money, but we can't make more time. So they value that like we all should, in a huge way. But they also, you touched on another point, which is I can only think of 3 out of the 100 that I wouldn't consider, at least from my interview and my research of them, what I would call generous human beings, meaning that what I loved about this book and loved about the majority of these people was that they are what I call the rooted rich. They really did love building their business and building their wealth. That was the natural byproduct. But they loved then making a difference in their hometowns. And that David has done that in spades, both in Washington and in New York. And he's not atypical in that regard. So that was, interestingly enough, as a journalist, I set out in the beginning and I thought, well, I've got to be really tough on these guys. And I found myself liking so many of them. And I said, this is going to be really hard. And I had a few more zingers in the original manuscript. And my editor took them out. And I said, why? Why are you taking them out? And he said, because these are great American heroes. And then, of course, the only criticism I got from the New York Times in the review was that I was too easy on these guys. So, but they were easy to love, and therefore they were really easy to be easy on in some ways. And I wasn't looking to, I wanted to know that they were clean, but I wasn't looking to find personal dirt on them necessarily. I was looking to anthropologically, sociologically find out what were the real commonalities between these 100 great American wealth creators.
Well,
Yes, sir.
It's nice that the richest men in town are the happiest people, but what about the reverse thing? That the happiest people sometimes are not the richest people. There's a lot of us that aren't the richest people, and I hope there are a lot of us that are the happiest people. So,
Isn't that wonderful? I hope so too.
So in a way, the book is sort of like, you talk is great, but the book rubs me a little bit the wrong way because I'm not the richest. But it rubs me the wrong way about values in our American society. Obviously, some of the richest people in town are the baseball players and the basketball players and football players, et cetera. But as compared to the scientists or the research people who are very, very happy and are not rewarded with riches, in a way, almost all the people in your book were rewarded because of the American way of rewarding people with money in certain kinds of areas, and they happen to be the happiest way. But it's also a cultural thing that you're saying in America that is common about all the richest people, and I'm not sure that I'm not happy with that as an individual, happy with that American kind of culture.
That you're not happy with that American?
No, I'm not happy with it because there's a lot of people who if I had my choice about being rewarded as in money, are not being rewarded now. Like, for example, people are doing basic research, people are great people,
right,
et cetera, doctors and so on and so forth. Well, they probably do pretty good. But it's a matter of like where, as an American, as a society, we place our values and reward people with wealth. And I think that there's something a little skewed with that.
Right. Well, I hear what you're saying. I'm an unapologetic capitalist, obviously, or else I wouldn't have admired these so much. But I do think if you read the book, you will see, and I think you will feel better about these people when you realize that they all say that the money was the byproduct of them adding some real value. And you can't get away from the fact that they built companies, they changed the landscape of the towns that they were in, they employed people, they made a difference in people's lives. And when I was interviewing people around them, now granted, people always tend to be nice to the richest man in town, right? But I found very few people who said, this is a guy who's gotten rich off the backs of somebody else. But I agree with you, there's a whole lot of ways to be rich in America, and it's not simply a matter of money. And I hope that comes through in the book. Yes, ma'am.
I think the difficulty comes in not defining riches. And if that had been defined, in your book, then you might have chosen different people.
And I might. And you know what? I actually have another book concept that looks at success through another lens. This went across the country to prove that you could make it, if you want to, in any town in America. And I think so often the media, as I said earlier, looks at things through the lenses of Wall Street or Hollywood, and we forget that in Akron, Ohio, good things are happening, and Bakersfield, California, and Carrollton, Georgia. And I thought that was really interesting to point out, because sometimes I think kids think, particularly, that you got to go to the big city to make it big. And I think what this book proves is that great success can take place anywhere else. But one of the concepts I'm looking at is the most successful person in several areas, and it's not defined by money, but it's by the difference that they actually made in an industry, as an example. So stay tuned for the next book. So I like hearing that.
Do we have any questions on that side of the house?
Yes, sir.
Down here.
I'll talk about it. Could you, I'm curious, since you're not going to go through all 12 commandments, and you talk very heavily about the first, what's the 12th?
The 12th, I'm glad you asked that. The 12th is actually one of my favorite, and that is never retire. Retirement is hazardous to your wealth and hazardous to your health, or at least that's what the RMITs believe. They can't imagine. Now, that's not to say that they don't change their careers, do different things, but the concept of suddenly going to some sunny seaside village and playing canasta all day is not their idea of the way to spend their golden years. They sort of want to die with their boots on. And that to a person. I remember yesterday on my radio show, I was interviewing Fred Levin, the richest man in Pensacola, Florida, and I asked him that very question. I said, Fred, you're 72 years old, you're still practicing law, you're building condominiums, you've got your hands in so many things. When are you going to retire? And he said what they all say, never. He said, the definition of retire for me is something you do to your car every 3 years, and that's it. Right there, yes, ma'am.
Did you find that they were all risk takers?
Well, responsible risk takers. Were they all risk takers? I wouldn't say they were. Obviously, most of these people are entrepreneurs. They started something, in most cases, from nothing. So that is risky by its very nature. A lot riskier than going to work for someone. So in that regard, yes. But I wouldn't say these were roll-the-dice people. And I'll tell you why. I asked them all, what's your favorite city in this country? And almost to a person, it was their hometown. And what's your least favorite city? And 90% of them said Las Vegas. So that risk takers in business, but not gamblers. Big difference.
Yes. Ask you a question. when you came to Omaha, Nebraska, you chose not to profile the best known man from Nebraska, Warren Buffett, but somebody else.
Right.
Why did you leave out Warren Buffett?
Because Warren Buffett wouldn't give me a good interview. But no, I had interviewed Warren for Worth before, and I sort of knew him a little bit. And I called him and I told him I was doing this book and that I would like to interview him. And he said, Randy, there's a book being written about me right now called Snowball that's going to come out. He said, everything, and I've told this writer that everything I've ever said is public or in the Berkshire Hathaway annual report. So I don't think I'm going to say anything new or exciting to you. And I said, you know what? You're right. You are overexposed, Warren. And so I called up Joe Ricketts, who's he's the only guy in the book that's technically the second richest man in town. And Joe is the guy who founded TD Ameritrade, and is just a wonderful guy. He has bison ranching interest, and he's now building new entrepreneurial companies now that he stepped down from the chairmanship of TD Ameritrade, and just a great, good old boy that grew up in Omaha, and I loved him. So that's the why.
Thank you.
Adrian.
What about their family lives? I mean, you talked about love at one point, but how did they do on that scale in terms of numbers of children and divorce or no?
Well, a good question, because the reason they're still the richest man or woman in town is they're still, for the most part, married to their first wife or husband. So there's very little divorce. Several of them were widowed, and a few of them had divorced and remarried, but had divorced early in life. I think of Bernie Jacobs at Home Depot. He'd been married to a second wife for 40 years. She was there through the whole Home Depot rise. So the vast majority of them have very stable families, amazingly. And they don't plan to leave a lot of their money to their kids because they don't want to rob them of their self-esteem or their ambition. They want them to have the same opportunities that they had to feel. The reason they're happy is because they've made it themselves. It wasn't sort of handed to them on the silver platter. Having said that, most of them in the latter part of an interview with me, when the guard comes down, would say that their families did sacrifice, or they sacrificed a lot in terms of being with their families, and probably their families sacrificed a good bit because of the time commitment that it took to build these fortunes. So it was not all rosy. And in fact, last night Fred Levin of Pensacola was 4 very successful children, but he was very honest in saying that it took a real toll on his wife and their marriage, even though they stuck together through it all. He said she had health problems as a result of all of the stress, and so it's never a straight line trajectory, and it's I said that if you were to graph the lives of these richest men and women in town, it would look like an electrocardiogram. You hear these stories, and they're sitting atop this great wealth and this great success, and you think it's been like this, and it's never been like that, both on the personal front and certainly on the business front. Yes, sir.
Did you ask any of them if they would change anything looking back? You talked about the family.
Mm-hmm. I did. I asked them all that, and I got answers that were not terribly enlightening, to be perfectly honest. Most of them said no. A few of them said I would have found a way to spend more time with my family, but and a few of them would say, well, I probably wouldn't have started that business. I mean, there were a few examples of where they got off track. Because there were a lot of these who were sort of bankrupt to billionaire. So it was not, one of the 12 commandments of wealth is fail to succeed. Failure is an option. And in fact, all of them, with the exception Jonathan Nelson of Providence, Rhode Island, admitted that they had had almost near cataclysmic failures at some point in their lives. And sometimes it was a family failure. In one case, it was a very traumatic divorce. But in most cases, it was some sort of business failure. But again, that was one of their great commonalities, is they had that ability to sort of pick themselves up by the bootstraps and move on to the next thing. Yes, sir.
Do I have to wait for the machine?
You sound good to me, but you'll sound even better.
Thank you. Early on, you said that one of the statements you heard over and over again was, it wasn't the money.
Right.
We were having fun. No one. Now, after interviewing these 100 people, how do you answer the following question? Would these people have achieved what they have achieved, not in terms of wealth, but in terms of their contribution to society, the customers, the employees, and so forth, if our tax rates were, say, double? And they knew going in that they would keep less than half, perhaps, or even far less than that.
I didn't ask that exact question, but my impression is that again, because it wasn't about money first, it was about the journey. It was about doing the thing that they enjoyed doing so much that they would have done it whether they became worth $100 million or $50 million or $5. I think that's very much sort of in their DNA. No, and like I said, most of these people had gone bust at some point, so that didn't seem to bother them. So I think, and I heard time and time again from, you would think they're all Republicans. No, it's almost about half and half. Well, a lot of them call themselves independents, but I have a sneaking suspicion they're really Republicans. But
I think we've got time for one final question. We have one?
Yes, ma'am.
Were any of them poor growing up, or were there any that didn't have a college education?
Sure. Were any of them poor growing up, or did any of them not have a college education? The vast majority were 88% of, or 88 of the 100 did have college degrees. There were 3 dropouts, and then some had some community college or a couple of years of college. They almost all valued higher education. But yes, many of them grew up dirt poor. And in fact, I think that drove a lot of their thinking too. Not for the money so much, but they wanted a different life. They wanted a different station in life. And in many ways, I think their childhood very much affected them, as it does all of us, I think. Okay, thank you all so much. It's nice to be back.